But Olympia Tumwater Foundation is a nonprofit group that the Schmidt started back in 1950. And the first project they did as a community project was the building and donating the Tivoli Fountain to the state capitol grounds. So that's, and from there it's grown. We've had the Tumwater Falls Park was built just in time for the Seattle World's Fair by 1962, so all that traffic came off the freeway. We're the largest scholarship group in Thurston County. Last year we gave away $140,000 in scholarships to high school seniors. So that's in fact, I think this year we hit overall totaled over the $2 million mark in scholarships over the years that we've been doing this, so it's really encouraging. And of course, we own and operate the Tumwater Falls Park. It's not a city park, it's a private park. And then also this house and grounds, which is a multi-use house. We have a lot of weddings and events here. We have our archives in the basement. Karen Johnson, our curator, and her volunteers down there. And we have our history programs and talks, and just a very fun job. This is my retirement job. I was a radio announcer as my career, and I've retired from that, and my hobby has turned into a paying job here. So it's kind of nice to have an office up in the upstairs bedroom. But those who are familiar with me know that I'm generally a positive person, and that's on purpose. It's my nature to want to encourage hope to those around me. I attempt to incorporate that attitude into everything I do, including my research and writing and talking about history. So that's why I tend to shy away from the negative aspects of human nature and history. It's embarrassing to acknowledge the mistakes of the past, but confession is good for the soul as long as it turns us in a better direction. And the value of learning our history is to do just that. Learn from our experiences and then press on to better things in the future. So I find myself laughing at the supermarket. Oops, here we go. Turn that on. Okay. At the supermarket tabloid magazine headlines. I tend to shun the pessimistic, depressing, and hateful emphasis that our current culture seems to dwell upon in the news and politics and entertainment. But recently, though, I found myself thinking about some of the more negative aspect of Tumwater history I've discovered during my research. And I asked myself, what would the tabloids do? Oops. That's me. Okay, there we go. So, the Tumwater Inquirer. I made that up, so don't try to look it up on YouTube or anything. But I asked myself, what would the tabloids or the imaginary Tumwater Inquirer say about things? And I'm not talking about the unbelievable headlines that you see on those, like Elvis Presley's ghost seen traveling the Oregon Trail, or alien zombies installed Tumwater's traffic circles overnight. That's I believe that. And then, or the mayor has acupuncture treatment and nearly leaks to death. Those kind of headlines we're not going to include here, but I'm talking about legitimate stories that are of a more negative nature than I normally would like to share. And we in Tumwater have our share of stories of sadness, scandal, immorality, tragedy, racism, conflict, and my favorite, just plain strange events. I love those. And since they're a part of our past, I decided to provide some balance to my local history talks by talking about the negative side a little bit. Rather than being accused of sugarcoating our history, I want to relate about the darker side of Tumwater's history today. So we'll be doing that. These stories are taken from journals, but mostly from newspaper reports of the day. I'll be quoting a lot from John Miller Murphy's newspaper, The Washington Standard, and some from other newspapers of the time also. But keep in mind that there really was no publication called the Tumwater Inquirer, so don't try to look it up in the library or on the internet or something like that. So, are you ready for this? Let's get started. Okay. An article from the February 2nd Morning Olympian from 1892. And it seems to be more of an opinion or commentary piece rather than a news story, but here's the quote. I'll go verbatim. There's a certain alley between two houses in Tumwater that is extensively traveled by members of the masculine portion of our community. They may be seen by threes, fours, and half dozens going into the alley, and upon reaching the back door of one of the houses, which is a place of business, ? They mysteriously disappear, and after remaining a short time, return whence they came. Is there not a law that places of business shall be closed on Sunday, or is there a discrimination in favor of back doors? So, as you can surmise, moral impropriety was found in Old Tumwater. It wasn't what we'd call a red light district, but you might call it a red lantern back alley or something like that. But that's the first to give you a taste for what we're talking about here. The next couple stories about our past is related by Daisy Ackley from her self-published memoirs, Wagon Wheels A-Rollin'. She was a child in Tumwater in the late 1800s. daughter of one of our doctors, Joseph Brown, actually. And I highly value her journal. It's full of great stories written in her old age, recounting a lot of memories from her childhood. The first story I want to share, and I don't really want to share it, but it involves early racism. And fair warning, I quote her politically incorrect words here verbatim, because it's hard to hear and hard to read even. But here's her words. There was an old John Chinaman who operated a washi-washi shop in a small shack, making his living by laundering clothes. It seems the Chinese were not very popular around Tumwater, for what reason we do not know, as he seemed to be a very peaceful and friendly sort of a Chinaman. Some of the town toughies, yes, there were teenagers who thought they were tough in that early day, though much has been said to the contrary, who hid on the hillside above where the China boy lived, and with their bean shooters pegged rocks at the house until the poor frightened old man, who had harmed no one, closed his shop and left the community. The Chinese, as a rule, are a very superstitious race, and we presume he thought about evil spirits haunting him. And it was the evil-minded spirits of those boys, whose greatest pleasure was derived by torturing some weak or helpless person. Afterwards, we hear that poor old man had entirely lost his reason from that fright the boys gave him. The boys should feel very proud of themselves, or more like be haunted with the thoughts of destroying the reason on a harmless old human being. And yes, they are human, unquote. So it's hard to hear, isn't it? But it takes you back to the attitudes of the late 1800s, too. Daisy also told a story that related to the old Biles tannery. She said scow loads of hemlock bark were brought into the tannery to be used in the tanning process. She shared her memories of a stray dog that wandered Tumwater for a time. I'll quote that one, too. It's a little bit cuter, but it's kind of negative, though, too, because there was a big, well, I'll quote her verbatim. There was a big black hound dog running around Tumwater. We can't recall who owned him, if anyone. He was forever snooping around in search of a stray crumb or morsel which had been shaken from someone's tablecloth, or possibly an egg from the hen which had an egg but didn't know where she'd laid it. One couldn't set anything out on a shelf to cool, lest if they but turned their back a minute, it would go down the red lane of that hungry old black mullet head, even if it were hotter than the sands of the desert, making his red lane even redder. One day, the old pest was prowling around the tannery, trying, we presume, to locate the ripe scent of whatever was assailing his twitching nostrils, when he made a misstep and landed in one of the vats of strong hair remover, getting his own hide tanned before its removal. He eventually, or naturally, gulped enough of that concoction to send him on to dog heaven. Several times I had made the attempt to try to tan his hide, but he was equipped with 4 legs, and while I, having but 2 and having to carry the cudgel, lost out. After his getting into the hair-removing soup, it ended the dog tail, also T-A-I-L. After his demise, one could set things out on a shelf to cool without having to stand guard over them. No such thing as a refrigerator or deep freeze was heard of in that day and age, except small ice boxes, and but few people around owned any of those. So that's the end of her quote of the dog. She was the same person who complained about tramps who refused a day's work when offered, saying the world owes me a living and I'm going to collect it. She concluded her rant by saying, every man to his own taste, as the fellow said when he kissed the cow. I love it. I love her way of phrasing things. So next, where would a tabloid like the Tumwater Enquirer be without a headline-grabbing murder story? Well, the historic town of Tumwater has not been noted for those kind of stories, although once in a while we've made the headlines in that way. The most famous took place in February of 1907. It involved the brutal murder of the head brewer of the Olympia Brewing Company at that time, 26-year-old Frank W. Lamp, an incident that stunned the residents of Tumwater and Olympia alike. The story, as related by the Morning Olympian in their Saturday edition, took place near the south end of the old Tumwater Long Bridge, the iconic wagon bridge that connected Tumwater with Olympia. It was just after 11 at night, and Lamp was walking from his home in the lower end of town, heading to the brewery. The details of the assault were quite confusing, since the Long Bridge was about 100 feet out of his way of his normal route to work, and add to that fact that his lunch basket was found about 40 feet out on the bridge itself. So apparently his assistant at the plant, who happened to be his brother-in-law, Jesse Winkle, just a few days previously had a quarrel with a supervisor, a bad one, and his relative, Mr. Lamp, Jesse Winkle remarked later to witnesses that someone would have to be fixed before the matter was settled. So a red flag going up there. Winkle waited in ambush that night for Lamp, and with a sharp, medium-sized pocket knife, he repeatedly and viciously stabbed Lamp, including at least 4 times near his heart. And there were no witnesses to the murder itself, but local residents heard the screams of Lamp as he cried out murder over and over again. The first person to reach the bleeding man was a next-door neighbor and fellow brewery worker, L.L. Cooper, and right on his heels was rural delivery carrier John Hopp. Several other men soon joined them, including brewery manager Peter G. Schmidt and Fred Hahn. Mrs. Robert McIntosh, who lived near the bridge, also showed up and overheard the final words of the dying man as Mr. Cooper folded a jacket to put under Frank's head. Someone in the group asked him who did this to him, and the reply was, Winkle. A few seconds later, as the men were lifting his head off the ground, Lamp said, "Let me down, fellows." And soon after lowering his head, he gasped, "I'm going now," and he was dead. So both the county sheriff and the police chief of Olympia, let me change here, that's the Long Bridge, by the way. Anyway, they were telephoned, and the search went out for Jesse Winkle. He was not at his home on West 4th Street in Olympia. Every avenue of escape was thought to have been guarded, including the Olympia docks and the train stations, but Winkle had made a clean escape. The follow-up investigations and searches turned up nothing, although a few years later, a man was found in San Francisco who matched the description of Winkle. So the man claimed to be someone entirely different, but authorities brought him here to Olympia to stand trial, but he had to be released because his identity could not be confirmed. It was unknown if the real Winkle was ever caught for the bloody, horrendous crime committed in the quiet little town of Tumwater. So there you have it. That's your big murder headline from the dark side of our past. But you say you want something more like a Perry Mason story of scandal and political intrigue. We have that too in our collection today. And this is a sad story from the spring of 1898 about the town's treasurer, Charles Hart. The short version is that Charles embezzled the town treasury for a total amount of $772. And once discovered, he left the area in fear and was found 3 years later running a store in Leadville, Colorado. He was arrested and extradited to stand trial back here in Olympia. Now, when I first came across this story, I found myself condemning the man and what he'd done. But as with many headline stories of scandals like this, as I looked deeper into the facts, my feelings for the man started to change. We need to go back a couple years for some context. In September of 1896, Charles's young wife, 26-year-old Maggie, died suddenly of blood poisoning. The young couple had 2 daughters, ages 8 and 6. So the couple had some relatives living nearby in South Union, off of Tilley Road, and there was great sorrow and grieving for everyone, especially so for Charles. In fact, he was so bereaved that he had to leave his business in the hands of others for a time, and that business was in the Palace Market, where Charles was a butcher. And when he returned, he found his business mired in a quagmire of debt. He tried to recover, but was unable to do so. Hart was serving as Tumwater's treasurer at the time, and under tremendous financial and emotional strain, he gave in to the temptation to use the town's funds to keep himself from business failure. He had hoped to pay it all back, but he found himself getting deeper in trouble and was about to be found out. So in fear, he left the country and abandoning his many duties for parts unknown. So once caught in Leadville by Sheriff Mills, he was brought back here from Colorado to stand trial in Superior Court. But his story made for a strong plea for clemency, so the prosecuting attorney concurred with that plea for the lightest possible sentence, and Charles got 6 months in county jail with a sentence to be suspended for good behavior. Hart ended up paying back to Tumwater the entire amount he'd taken, and the sad story in this case had a good ending, and that's the way I'd like all my Tumwater Inquirer stories to end. So that's Charles. You know, I think I'd like to go back to quoting from old newspaper accounts that could qualify for the tabloid theme of today's presentation. This is a kind of a strange one that was found in the Washington Standard in their June 16th, 1899 issue. And I hate to bring it up because it puts a negative light on a member of one of the most respected families in our history. Let me quote verbatim again. J.T. Bush of Bush Prairie, better known as Tall Bush, was last Monday committed to the Hospital for the Insane at Steilacoom for an action which the authorities considered prima facie evidence of insanity, the stealing of a bicycle belonging to the county assessor. Whether it was stealing a bicycle per se or stealing it from an officer possessing such mighty power for retaliation that betrayed mental aberration does not appear in the evidence on which he was convicted. Tall made the point that he had filed off the factory number of the machine, a precaution against identification that no insane man would adopt. But notwithstanding this proof of mental balance, Mr. Bush was taken to the State Institution for Restraint of People with Kleptomaniac Impulses. End quote. So that's the story. It leaves many questions unanswered, including the obvious question, if you suffer from kleptomania, can you take anything for it? That's the way my mind works. Okay. Excuse me. No, yeah, it's such a dark topic, we need to lighten it up once in a while. But on the negative side of history, we often come across tragedies from natural causes like storms and earthquakes and fires. Many Tumwater old-timers will remember the big fires at the famous Tai Hotel that caused a rebuilding of that structure 2 different times. Some people were here for that. Other wooden buildings were burned to the ground in Tumwater over the years. I think of the Tumwater Club, built by the Schmidts for their employees and for use by the community. Fire totally consumed that structure next to the Gillette and Guffey drugstore in Tumwater. Tumwater Square, 1955 is when that happened. Many homes and businesses made of wood in the old days caught fire, especially in the age of oil lamps and wood heat. Fires consumed major parts of many towns and cities around the country in those days. So let me go to this. Sometimes bad news was caused by accidents, and such an incident was reported in an article after the fact in the December 23, 1898 Washington Standard. And this one involved a Lincoln flour mill owned by the Crosbys. John Miller Murphy seemed to have a bad opinion of the Crosbys and expressed it in his article in some ways, and so I take it with a grain of salt as I quote verbatim here. He says, "The Crosby Mill at the foot of the falls on Tidewater, a 5-story equipped with up-to-date machinery at the time of its opening in 1861, the frame of which still stands, was operated at a loss and closed after a short career of disaster. It was an unlikely venture from the beginning. The day it was opened was made an occasion for rejoicing, and quite a number of visitors were present to witness starting up the machinery. A daughter of Mr. Biles of Tumwater happened to be stepping over a revolving pinion by which her clothing was caught, and before the machinery could be stopped, she was fearfully mangled and killed. This tragedy seemed to forebode the fate of the enterprise. It was never successful, always a money loser, and involved its owners in an inextricable load of debt," end quote. So, very sad tale, and the editor's commentary I take with a grain of salt because I think he was maybe on a political other side of the Crosbys or something, I'm not sure, but they were one of our town's earliest businessmen, and Bing Crosby related to them, by the way. But let me quote from another Washington Standard article that included some commentary that I find myself in some agreement with. It's from October 28, 1898. It reads, quote, "Some miscreant has been engaging in marring and defacing the gravestones on Oddfellow Cemetery, and that has appropriated $50 to discover the villain. If found, he should be buried head down alive. The punishment that Dante proposed for scandal mongers," end quote. So, interesting. The newspaper accounts are always fun. It seems that every generation has to deal with the problem of vandalism and disrespect, and in our past it's the same. Since we've touched on the topic of the dead in our Tumwater Inquirer examination, let me take us to a weird story that appeared in the Washington Standard right at the turn of the century. Here it is, I'll just quote it. "The body of Thomas Guslander still remains unburied at Tumwater, although his supposed death resulted nearly 3 weeks ago. The parents still insist that his interment should not be made until it's positively shown that he is dead. As yet, quite a number of the conditions of dissolution are not apparent." End quote. I don't know. So far I've found no follow-up report on this story from around 1900, but it was so strange that I just had to include it here for the Tumwater Inquirer. So there we are. Another negative aspect of history involves sickness and infectious disease that occasionally strikes a community. One of the Standard's notices from December 19, 1902 included this, quote, "The Tumwater schools have been temporarily closed owing to the prevalence of scarlet fever. 2 cases are reported," end quote. It wasn't a teacher strike in those days. I shouldn't have added that, should I? We'll have to edit that out. Okay. Another related story came from a student newspaper called the Tumwater School Chatterbox in 1940. And this is actually a photograph, Merle Junk photo, of the old Michael T. Simmons brick building gymnasium that was inside the building and the classrooms built all around it. So that's the same auditorium that I graduated 8th grade from, the last one before the middle school was built. Anyway, so I like that picture that way. But it reflects this Tumwater School Chatterbox. The headline read, "Illness closes schools. During January through February, the absences in school have been very great. Most of the absences have been due to colds, flu, and a few cases of measles. On the 21st and 22nd of January, there were 75 pupils absent and 84 on the 23rd. School was closed on the 24th and remained closed until the 29th. At the present time, the absences have decreased to about 40. This decline should be credited largely to the untiring work of our new school nurse, Miss Libby. So, end quote. So throughout our history, these issues have appeared, often hitting the schools. Measles outbreaks, mumps, influenza could be quite serious, and were dealt with as quickly as you can expect. Just a note here I had to share. It's something I want to add to my repertoire of quips. One old-timer was asked if he'd lived here all his life. His reply was, "Not yet." I love it. I use that now. That may have been from the same guy who once rubbed Crisco on himself to get taller. Didn't work, because that's shortening. Lighten up, okay, here we go. Well, Tumwater's growing into a real city today. In fact, it's getting awfully cityfied to my taste. But it wasn't always that way. For many years, Tumwater was quite small. So I came upon a list of descriptions of small towns, and I'll go through just a few of these and let you determine how many might apply to our community's history. One says, "We have a four-way stop, but only two ways go anywhere." I love it. All right. Here's another one. "They painted a yellow stripe down the middle of Main Street, but later a car came by and scattered the gravel." I love this one too. "When they made Main Street one way, people left town and couldn't legally get back in." One more of those. "The town passed a curfew ordinance but had to repeal it. Every time the bell rang at 9 o'clock, it woke everybody up." All right, okay. Now we can get back to the negative side. Let's go back to some of our tabloid-type stories. And the next one is from our favorite, the Washington Standard, dated July 6, 1900. "The balloon ascension announced at Tumwater at 3 o'clock did not come off until 5 o'clock on account of the windstorm that prevailed at that hour. However, a splendid ascent as well as a parachute descent was made by Professor Hamilton. The balloon floated to the westward, and the aeronaut landed about a mile east and south of town. He landed in a dead tree and was injured quite severely by it falling with his weight." End quote. Interesting. Kind of strange, isn't it? This was in an era when a lot of experimentation was going on with flight, including hot air balloons and gliders, and the Wright brothers flying the first motorized airplane back east. It was a new era of barnstormers and biplanes and airmail and the eventual building of the Olympia Airport south of Tumwater on the old Bush family farm. So no self-respecting tabloid would be without stories of a legal nature. Conflicts and lawsuits often make for good headlines. So I go to a different newspaper for this one from 1903. The Morning Olympian wrote an article that covered a controversy involving the younger brother of Leopold Schmidt, Louis Schmidt. Now, Louis at this time was on the board of trustees for the town of Tumwater, which is equivalent to today's city council. He was also the supervisor of the brewery's bottling operation at that time and lived in the little house halfway down the hill between the brewery and the Schmidt House called the Hillside Inn. Let me shift to pictures here. There we are. I'll quote it here. "Louis Schmidt, councilman of Tumwater, yesterday swore out a warrant for the arrest of H. Powell, foreman of construction for the Pacific Bridge Company, contractors now engaged in building the new power station at Tumwater for the Olympia Light and Power Company. Mr. Powell is charged with maintaining a nuisance to endanger the houses of the people in the vicinity of the falls. Mr. Schmidt made frequent complaint, but as the missiles continued to fly from the blasting, he continued to try the justice court. Mr. Powell's hearing has been set for Friday afternoon, and he provided the necessary bail pending the hearing." The fact that the chief of police Cusack of Tumwater had notified the blasting crews to use brush mats to prevent the flying stones was mentioned in the Olympian some time ago. Mr. Schmidt claims that this has not been done, and that recently a 16-pound stone crashed through the brewery roof, and another went through the roof of his house. The contractors claim that it is a difficult matter to prevent, and that they're acting as careful as it is possible to do, and are willing to do even better if possible. End quote. You rock. No, anyway, this is just one of the many examples. I'm sorry. She's a good audience. I'm glad she's in the front row. This is just one of the many examples of lawsuits and legal disagreements in our town's past, something that's common in all communities. It makes for interesting headlines that help sell newspapers. And if you can imagine how that kind of story would have been covered on today's internet, if they would have had that. But another tabloid type of story came from 1904, when there was a wildlife park with elk, swans, and bear at the current site of the Upper Falls Park. The park was a kind of a predecessor to our Northwest Trek of today, built to attract visitors from Olympia to come out to the end of the streetcar line at Tumwater with their picnic lunches and visit the animals and see the waterfalls of the Deschutes. The following story was found in the Washington Standard on April 1st of that year, which was 1904, and I'll quote it here. In returning one of the bears in Tumwater Park to the enclosure from which he had escaped Tuesday, Arthur Dye was severely bitten by the brute, and R.F. Nichols, a watchman in the yards of the Northern Pacific Railway, likewise suffered from the teeth of the enraged animal. A posse of citizens went after him, who still showed fight, and a rifle had to be brought into requisition to subdue his wild spirit. The remedy, however, resulted in the death of the Bruin, end quote. So interesting. The wildlife park, you don't keep bears and not expect something to go wrong. But anyway. And then they put up a sign that said bear left. No, that's, I didn't have that in my script. It just came to my mind. Okay. Well, political scandals that reflect cultural change are always a popular topic in the tabloids and newspapers. Battles for the women's right to vote, maybe support for prohibition were prime examples. But here in Tumwater, we had our own story from 1960 that would certainly qualify for Tumwater Inquirer headlines. And it deals with our very first female member of the city council. And her name was Marion Argo. The series of stories about her rather stormy election and two-year term on the council were chronicled in the Daily Olympian. The coverage began on January 14th of 1960, when the paper reported that Argo was the first woman in the history of Tumwater to file for a municipal office. She was running against 10 other candidates for the March 8th election, all of them men, including some names you might recognize, like Jim Brown and Ray Ensley. Born in Sioux City, Iowa in 1898, she'd been a county resident since 1929 and was involved in real estate. The campaigns progressed, and after Election Day, the March 9th article in the Olympian printed the headline, "Voters in Tumwater elect first woman member for council." The article said that her reaction was one of surprise, since she didn't have any particular projects in mind, other than an interest in construction of a high school. That's before Tumwater High was built. So this is where things got a little sticky. So let me quote now from an Olympian article from April 24th of that same year. The headline read, "Men toss out first woman town leader." And the story went like this: the Tumwater Town Council has ousted the first woman ever elected to serve on the group in the settlement's 110-year history. Suntanned Marion Argo received the word of the unexpected action on return from a vacation in Panama. She declined comment until she had time to consult with her attorney. There's every indication that Tumwater leaders decided to clamp a lid of secrecy on the action, which was taken last Tuesday at a council meeting that received no advance billing. Efforts of a Daily Olympian reporter to learn what happened during the session received neither assistance nor encouragement from the town hall. In a letter signed "Sincerely Town Council, Town of Tumwater," Miss Argo was informed that the action against her was taken during a session last week. The council based its move on the fact that Miss Argo was not present for 3 consecutive meetings without requesting a leave of absence. A state law allows a town council seat unfilled for that period to be declared vacant. She missed April 5th, 12th, and 19th meetings, and personnel in the town's clerk's office claimed nothing of importance had occurred, end quote. So a couple days later, it was reported that she had consulted an attorney, and her position was that the council had acted improperly, and she still was a member of the body. Mayor Frank Phillips was absent for most of that controversy because he was home recovering from a blood clot, so acting mayor Harley McWilliams declined to comment, but then Harold Boone on the council stated to the paper, quote, "She's no more a council member than you are," end quote. So the April 27th newspaper report began with the headline, "Argo rejoins Tumwater Town Council. Large crowd sees other city leaders end seat argument." According to that report, the 60-year-old Argo came to the meeting of the council and packed out City Hall with her supporters. There were more than 100, most of them women, and her case was stated plainly in one quote from the article. It said, "Seldom in recent history has a Tumwater council held as many meetings in a month. No notice of the extra sessions was given to the media," end quote. So she refused to be sworn into office since she was claiming to already be a member of the council, and she just took her seat. And after about an hour and a half of debate, she decided to be sworn in again just to allay confusion. And so it was quite the story. During her term, Marion Argo led an effort to upgrade Tumwater from a 4th class to a 3rd class city, allowing for annexations and for more growth. Marion died at age 71 on December 31st, 1969, and is buried at the Masonic Cemetery in Tumwater. So there's your political scandal and intrigue, and that's the most recent story I have in my... in fact, I have refrained from talking about other scandals and Tumwater stories taking place after 1960, because many of those involved may still be alive and possibly take offense at me and cause another lawsuit that would then add to my collection of Tumwater Inquirer stories, and I don't want to do that. It wouldn't be worth the trouble. Now, in our modern day, there are many stories of scams, cheating people of their hard-earned honest income or savings. Our mythical Tumwater Inquirer would certainly include such a story, especially one that involves the highly respected member of Tumwater, the founder of Tumwater, I should say, Michael T. Simmons. Simmons did not remain in Tumwater with his gristmill and sawmill businesses for very many years. He sold out his claim next to the river to the Crosbys, who made a real success of their holdings along the Deschutes. Simmons found himself a partner, Charles H. Smith, and began a general store in Olympia. The stock and supplies came in on the ship Orbit at the Percival Docks. Their new firm was named Smith & Simmons, and was the only place where people in those early days could buy supplies without the restrictions placed on them by the Hudson Bay Company at Fort Nisqually. So to deal at the fort with Dr. Tolmie's people, settlers had to prove their need in order to purchase their items. The Smith & Simmons store was located at 1st and Main in Olympia, Capitol Way, in other words. It was a simple, crude building with a rough plank table filled with a stock of basic necessities and a certain amount of trinkets with a special appeal to the local tribes. Charles Smith, the manager of the store, came to Olympia on the Orbit, which had been purchased by a group of Olympia Newmarket residents, including Sylvester, Eby, Shaw, Moore, and Jackson. Mike Simmons later purchased Jackson's interest for the same $35,000 paid him by Clan Rick Crosby for his properties in Tumwater. Smith gained the trust and respect of Simmons, so much so that Simmons asked Smith to act as a tutor for his older children. The two became friends and partners and began a very profitable operation. Smith sailed with the Orbit to San Francisco with a load of lumber, which was sold at a good profit. And with those profits, he bought more supplies for the store and brought them back to Olympia. And these new items were then sold for such a great profit that Smith was considered a genius financially. Potential financial power on the West Coast, they said. Michael Simmons had such faith in Smith that he agreed to the suggestion that Smith make another trip with the Orbit, even though Simmons couldn't quite understand why Smith was so anxious to make the trip alone. Red flags should have been raised at that point, but a trust had been built by Smith, so once again the ship was loaded with lumber, and Smith was sent again to San Francisco with all the available cash of the business, some $30,000 of Simmons' money. Sure enough, once in California, Smith sold the lumber and then disappeared, taking with him $60,000 in gold. And upon learning of that devastating theft, the normally kind and mild-mannered Simmons stated that Smith was the only man he had ever known whom he would like to kill. He was angry. So Simmons died almost penniless, really, but a lot of honor, of course, for him. So my final story in today's talk about the darker side of Tumwater's history is one that I like, and not only because it happens to be a story concerning one of my relatives, Jesse Ferguson. I like it because it's not only good material that would fit a tabloid style of publication, but also ends in a positive way, and that reflects the moral cultural battles that took place in those times. I got the story from our favorite newspaper this hour, the Washington Standard, February 4th, 1898 edition. And I'll quote and paraphrase the longer article because of time restraints here. Quote, Jesse, as patriarch of the Belmore community, was appealed to by a Miss Ida Robinson to protect her from an impending dishonor and personal disaster. At 17 years old, she was an adopted daughter of the Robinsons, who had returned from a brief residence in California. The adoptive parents wanted to give her in marriage to a W.J. Marshall, whom they met in California. He wanted her to come with him to the Klondike. The girl said she did not want this marriage, and that Marshall was not a man of principle, and that she was induced by her adoptive parents to write Marshall to come up from California, and was quite suspicious that this was a deliberate attempt to make her personal charms the object of barter amid the unconventional habits of camp life. In other words, force her into prostitution. So the story continued. Jessie came to her defense by spiriting her away from her foster parents' home on a Saturday morning and placed her in charge of Jessie's married daughter, Mrs. Lee. The Robinsons were incensed at this abduction, as was the prospective bridegroom. They finally found where she was hiding and approached the girl with words of honey and professions of peace. She was coaxed to return home to get her clothing. But meanwhile, Marshall made threats towards Jessie and others and was then brought before Justice King on a Monday afternoon and put in jail under $300 bond. The Robinsons by Wednesday left for Alaska, leaving the daughter in the charge of her new friends and rescuers. So it was a happy ending thanks to the efforts of Uncle Jesse Ferguson. Yeah, so I like that one. So there you have it. Let's see, there we go. The darker side of Tumwater's history. I thought since I'm only getting older, I should include this in my repertoire. Getting older. To provide balance for the historical record, of course. I want to remain focused on the positive side, because very little gets changed for the good through focusing on the negative. It's not constructive to be constantly critical. Good change is most often accomplished by pursuing lofty goals and ideals, seeing a vision and pursuing it. Everyone stumbles along the way, and the response should be to learn from it, get up and learn and press on. So that's what I hope to do. And I think I heard some of you laugh under your breath when I said I'm getting older, because I'm now at the stage of Medicare officially as of June. I'm 65, so I'm a Medicare, and now I'm official senior citizen. But many of you are my elders, and you've already gone through this, so it doesn't impress you at all. But I know I'm getting to my elderly stage of life. I call it my snapdragon period, because part of me has lost a snap and the rest of me is dragon. Even my hot flashers are getting lukewarm. Everything's starting to click for me, though. My knees, my elbows, my neck. And I'm at the age when I put a seashell up to my ear, the sound reminds me of Alka-Seltzer. And I stay away from organic foods. I figure at this age I need all the preservatives I can get. Oh, I messed up that line a little bit. But anyway, thank you so much for your interest in local history and for all your encouragement for our Heritage Builders program. It means so much to have you here and pack out the house this first day. The next talk, and you'll see on your brochures, the new ones that we have, is Thursday, October 11th, and that'll be Shelton and the Washington timber industry with Mike Fredson from Mason County. So Tumwater was involved with timber, as you know, from sawmills and things like that, and a lot of the timber employees around the area lived in Tumwater. So we're going to learn from Mike Fredson with a Mason County focus, because there's not too many left in Thurston County that work in timber anymore. But that's for next month, October 11th, and again, it's on a Thursday. So that is my talk, and we do have a little bit of time. I try to leave time for Q&A, so are there any Q's that I can A with you? Any thoughts or whatever? No questions, no comments, no. One back there, and then I'll come up here. Yes?
Well, some people might not like me to say this, but I lived in Seattle for a long time, and then I've been here almost 10 years, and I really like living here. But in the last year, I started getting the Olympian. I never really subscribed to it before. I read it some, but I didn't subscribe. So
Right.
I'm reading it every morning. And I'm sort of appalled at all the horrible stories they run all the time. I've never read a newspaper that's done that so much, but maybe it's because I haven't lived in a small town.
Maybe they should change their name to the Tumwater Inquirer. I don't know. Interesting. Up here, you had a question or a comment?
The picture you had of the long bridge, where was that?
Well, the Tumwater end of it connected Tumwater to Olympia in the old days. It was a wagon bridge, wooden level like wagon bridge, and there was a turnstile on it. So at high tide, that would be opened, and shallow draft barges and boats could come up and service all the water-driven industries of the falls, and then get back before the tide went down, like Mud Bay, the estuary. And so that bridge started on our side, roughly where the new toys are at Tumwater Historical Park. That's where the bridge pretty much started, and then made its way straight across to Olympia. In fact, the Olympia side street, I think it's called a Oregon Trail Street or Drive or something like that. There's still a remnant of that people live on. Is a dead-end street now. Roughly where the toys are for the Tumwater Historic Park down below. You know, where those toys that kids play on, and they just replaced them recently. So that's pretty much where the start of the bridge was. Pretty long. It was a famous structure of Tumwater for many years. But once cars came...
You should put that map back up. But the Tumwater is different than Tumwater today, then, because it's not considered Tumwater over there now.
Well, Tumwater and Olympia butt up against each other, so there's a little confusion where the borders are. In fact, in the days when they started to butt up against each other, let's see, I got to find that long bridge. Now you get to have a review backwards. I should talk backwards. Bush Tall of Story Odd the. Charles Hart, okay, where is this? Come on. Come on. There we are. Yeah. So there you see where we're sitting right now is on the hillside up here. There's the Schmidt House where we are right now. And then there's the old brewery complex down below. And so there's the Long Bridge looking to the south.
There was a green map. There was a green map that was kind of an aerial map.
Aerial. Those were photos from. Before your talk.
Before the talk. Oh, yeah, that was on a different set of pictures. I'd have to redo this computer. And yeah, there. In fact, some of our brochures have a map of the historic district on the back, like our Riverwalk tour brochure, a little rack card.
I mean, that Troy's place, but where the Troys are, is just down below there.
Yes, and Crosby. Right. And you can look across and see the old brew house from there. Yeah, it's worth a trip. And the Crosby House is open to the public on Sunday afternoons. And just last Sunday, we had a 3-house event. We've had 2 of those now, where we open all 3 houses, Henderson, Crosby, and this one. And I think we'll do more of that in the near future now that we're starting to do the curating of the former Henderson house. Anything else? Yes, back by the camera.
I think possibly from your background in media, you can answer this. The Daily Olympian, I'm assuming, was an independently owned newspaper in the day.
Yeah.
But I understand it has been bought out by Tashi.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering,
Tacoma News Tribune actually prints it and so on.
in your opinion, does it still represent a lot of the issues of this area?
Very little. They do try to, but it's almost like a newsletter instead of a newspaper anymore. So, and really it's because of the internet and the popularity of online.
Tough market.
Yeah, most newspapers are having troubles. Yeah.
If you look at the e-edition, it's twice as big because they have a whole big section in color.
Yeah.
It's like it seems like they're encouraging you to do that.
They are. They realize the public's already going with the e-rat. Yeah.
Anymore, and they won't have to pay carriers.
Well, that's right too. They're trying to cost cut. Anything else? I saw another hand. Yes.
Bootlegging, was there any of that down here?
I think of the old song, "She was a moonshiner's daughter, but I love her still." But yes, moonshining was a big thing during Prohibition here. And of course, Prohibition shut down the Olympia Brewing Company at the peak of their success. And the Schmidts got into hotels. Peter and his brothers already had started getting involved in hotels and transportation also. But they had, well, in fact, they're the predecessor to the modern Westin hotel chain of today. That was an offshoot of what the Schmidt started back then during Prohibition. So they didn't let Prohibition throw them for too much of a loop. They tried to restore the old brewery into making apple juice products, and that didn't succeed financially. So they ended up renting out or leasing out the buildings to other businesses. And then when the Prohibition was lifted, they wanted to start again. They still had the heart for brewing, but they couldn't make that old complex work for a modern operation in the 1930s. And so they decided they needed to stay near the river where the artesian water was, because that's extremely important to the Olympia beer. And so they went upstream to start from scratch. And that's why you see the buildings up here. That's the post-Prohibition brewery. And once again, we became the largest employer in the area. And once it became one of the top 10 brewers in the nation. We bought out Hams and Lone Star and finally had to get gobbled up by Pabst and Miller. Yes?
Wasn't there a Chinatown down by the waterfront?
Yeah, kind of near where Capitol Lake Fair now is. That was kind of a Chinatown type of area, I think. That general vicinity. Yeah, there. Yes, huh?
What do you know about Tumwater Club? I remember watching that film burn.
Yeah, 1955. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a bowling alley and a grocery store was in there, and I didn't know there was anything more.
And a roller skating rink, too. Yeah. But before all that, the Schmidts built it as a kind of an athletic club. And the first floor was a big meeting room with the largest maple floor in the whole state at the time. They built it back in the 1900 something is when they built it. But it became the host location for governor inaugural balls, Red Cross dances for World War I support, all kinds of different things that the community gathered there. So it was a multi-purpose building that was well used. But yeah, after a while, after it became the bowling alley that my uncle, by the way, my mom's younger brother, in his teenage years was a pin setter. Because they didn't have automatic stuff. He had to go set the pins back up. But interesting stuff. Anyway, yes, the Tumwater Club was a big part of Tumwater's history. Okay, well, oh, Larry.
Yeah, Don, I wanted to ask you, in your research, did you run across anything that was the weird, unexplained, anything in the sky, you know, that might have come zipping in?
Well, I told a few of them even in this presentation with the guy that was dead, but they didn't want to bury him because, yeah, there's just odd things.
Asteroid shooting stars, and you know, because it was a dark sky.
No UFO stories or anything like that. No, none of that. No.
Bigfoot?
Bigfoot, I didn't see any of that yet. No. There were some native Indian legends of a couple that, I shouldn't share it because I don't remember how it went, but somebody up in Hicks Lake or Patterson Lake, one of those lakes up above, one of the the spouse of one of the Indians died and got drowned in the lake, and they said that they couldn't find his body, but it ended up at the lower falls of the Deschutes, from some underground stream or something. And then whenever the falls reaches a certain level of water power, you can hear the voices of those Indian spouse calling out to the other, you know. So those kind of legends are there, but...
What about the ghost in this house?
Well, there was a ghost in the house after Clara Schmidt. After she'd passed away, Bob Krim, who worked for the house and the family for 60 years, he was taking care of this house, and he would see her in the upstairs hallway wearing a pink dressing gown of some sort, because she always wore that bathrobe or that robe through the middle of the day before she'd get dressed in her normal clothes. But that ghost, she wouldn't respond to him. He could put his hand through her, kind of like those Hollywood things. And he didn't want to tell people at first because he thought people would say he was drunk on Olympia beer or something. But he said other people saw it too. We rented the house out for weddings, and the weddings would see that ghost going down the hallway. There was cleaning ladies that Bob said that one lady would come over to clean every week, and she saw the ghost and she wouldn't come back. And so they got two from the brewery to come over, and they saw the ghost and they wouldn't come back. It finally took 4 ladies to come over here and clean the house each week because of the fright from that ghost. And after 10 years, it stopped and hasn't been seen since. So that would have been 1960 to 70, roughly that time frame, I think. Yeah. Boy, you're making me stretch here. Yes?
I'm wondering, do you know the origin of the name Tumwater?
It was an Indian Chinook trading language name that they had for the falls here, called Tumchuck, or noisy water, loud water. And our early settlers didn't like Michael T. Simmons' name of Newmarket. And so they took that Tumchuck and Americanized that, and it became Tumwater, and that name stuck. Everybody liked that. So that's where the name comes from. Okay, boy. Well, I have more stories. But one thing I like about Tumwater history is that negatives are always turned into positives. It was racism in Oregon that forced our Simmons-Bush party to come north of the Columbia in the British territory at the time, because George Bush was part black and mixed race, and his white wife and the mixed race kids, they wouldn't be allowed to settle on the American side of the river, so they were forced to the British side, and that caused them to come up here and start Tumwater, the first permanent American community in the state of Washington. So a negative turned into a positive. Tumwater's location has caused all kinds of traffic-related disruptions over the years, so that could be called a negative. But it kept the city vibrant and growing and visible, because they were always moving around. We don't have a city center because traffic kept changing things.
Because they put I-5 through.
Well, that's one of the things. Yeah, and Prohibition shut down the successful brewery, so that would be a negative. But the Schmidts were resilient, and they held on until it was lifted, and the business became one of the top 10 in the nation. Northern Pacific Railroad decided to bypass Tumwater Olympia in favor of Tacoma for their terminus. And so that was a negative, but it forced our communities of Olympia and Tumwater to work together. All their petty differences were put aside, and they built their own narrow gauge railway from Olympia right through Tumwater down to Tenino to hook into the Northern Pacific. So it became a rail connection that helped us keep our capital city status and keep our towns growing. So a negative turned into a positive again. 1893, there was a recession that cushioned, well, we were cushioned rather economically by the Yukon gold rush around here, but the arrival of the Schmidts in 1895 took that negative depression years and turned it into a positive, becoming the biggest employer in the area, and the Schmidts got started that way. The traffic bottleneck in Tumwater's portion of the Pacific Coast Highway, Old 99, led to the Carline Bridge, or Totem Pole Bridge, being built. And that changed our traffic pattern to make a straight shot through Tumwater instead of going through all the sharp curves that used to be. So we took that negative of the bottleneck and it turned into a positive, and all the town center became Tumwater Square area, where Safeway and Gillette and Guffey and all that is. I-5 tearing out Tumwater, that could have been a negative, but it caused the formation of our historic district, parks. We got Crosby House and Henderson House restored and are preserved. It spurred growth at the Trosper Road interchange, so we started to move south, Southgate on one side, Tyee on the other. And so the negatives, the so-called negatives, turned into a positive again. So the one question you think, well, what about the shutting down of the brewery back in 2003? How could that negative be overcome? What was the positive out of that? And I could think of a few things: tourism, growth, parks and district and Schmidt House and so on. State offices started to move into our city, and we had the Tumwater skyscrapers, L&I building and stuff like that. And then the vision that's growing now of a craft brewing center based on our history, and the craft brewers are pulling together, and the community college and all these community groups are working together for that. So all this negativity turns into a positive, and that's what I like about Tumwater. And so I'm pretty proud of this place. Yes, back there.
Do you know if anything's ever going to be able to get done with the old brewery building?
No, I don't know. There is actually the owner of the complex down below, about 2.5 years ago, donated the brick tower building to the city of Tumwater free and clear, and then about 12 feet around it and access to it. And so the city of Tumwater has been raising in-kind contributions of material and labor and all kinds of contributions. And so this last November, December, the very needed emergency work has been done on it with a new temporary roof and closing up all the window openings. So it's actually dry inside that building for the first time in generations. It's just so nice to see, to get down there. I had a chance to go in there in person, but something's happening down there finally, with visions of it eventually becoming something the public can go into again. But $6.5 million later is when that can happen. So who knows how long that'll take. But it's going to be part of the plans are for be a part of the county trail system, pedestrian footbridge over the Deschutes where the old rail bridge used to be. And so I'm hoping all that happens, but it's going to take a lot of fundraising. But that tower building is an iconic structure for Tumwater. It's our trademark, so it's worth pursuing. Okay, I'm going to have to close things out. We got an early start, so we should leave early too. But don't forget to get your brochures with our new season. Thank you so much.